It's a real blessing to be here this morning with friends and colleagues to hear the Word of God proclaimed and examined, to share time with friends old and new. And I'm grateful. I told Bruce McClarty a minute ago that my sister is an alumna of Harding University and never fails to tell me of all the wonderful things that happen in Searcy, which I mostly believe. And I tell her we are all on the same side, and that is true. And it's wonderful to be with my brother Todd, whom I usually see in other kinds of settings, but I'm glad to be together with him, and with Daniel, whom I kept missing. Every time I went to Croatia, they would say he'd gone somewhere else, which I began to take personally, but I'm glad not to have to do that. And with all the rest, and with Eddie Sharp and Brent Isbell, whom for the last 13 years I've had the privilege of listening to every Sunday. So I think that the condition of preaching in Churches of Christ is absolutely fabulous, because, well, I'm spoiled. Maybe my sample is too small. I don't know. It is an important missiological principle that the missionary should accommodate him or herself to the cultural practices of the environment in which he finds herself. So if the people around you are naked, you should be naked too. And therefore I've abandoned my tie this morning. And my mission team with Keith, well, we're doing our best. But the barrels of used clothing are coming. That's all I can say. All right, obscure 19th century mission jokes don't work. I'll make a note of that. We began a little bit of introduction, and so yesterday about the book of Hosea. So what I want to do today is to dig into it more deeply and to think about how it's put together and what it says, because as in all the other prophetic books, the relationship between what it says and how it says it is very important. And so I want to start, though, not by talking about the text yet, give me 5 more minutes, but by talking about some of the things that are underneath and inside the text. What makes the text tick, if you will? It's what some modern scholars in history, at least where I've encountered it in the history of the modern world, of a scholar named David Cannadine, who teaches at Princeton, and who writes about monarchy and things like that in the 19th and 20th century, calls them the hinterlands of people and of texts. All of us have these things, the things that we do that make us us. The hobbies we have, the relationships we have, the things we have but wish we didn't have, all those things that make us who we are. And there are some hinterlands, if you will, not just for the book of Hosea, but for prophetic books as a whole. You know, prophecy didn't begin in ancient Israel. The earliest prophets that we know about came from the middle of the second millennium in a little town, actually at the time a big town, called Mari on the middle Euphrates, 15th, 16th, 17th century BC. Prophetic texts in which men or women spoke for the gods. And it was, I think, probably not much different from whatever happened at Delphi in Greece, in which a spokesperson, a priest or priestess, is consulted on various issues. You say, should we do this, that, or the other? And the answer is, well, let me check with the deity. And these prophetic texts did exist. They existed also in the time of ancient Israel, and so from Assyria we have prophetic texts as well. They are usually very short and very straightforward in an enigmatic kind of way. Because if you're a good prophet, you do want to hedge your bets a little bit. As the famous story of Croesus of Lydia, who asked the Delphic oracle should I go up and fight the Persians? And the answer is something like, well, a great empire will fail, which could mean almost anything, and in fact did. So these kinds of things existed in the ancient world, and they must have existed in Israel too. They did exist in Israel. But that's not primarily what we have in the Bible. What we have in the Bible is a new genre that was invented called the prophetic book. And it's a collection of oracles, many of which are not exactly enigmatic. In fact, it's not that we don't understand them that's just the problem. The problem is we do understand them, we just don't like them very much because they say some very blunt things. They are not just books responding to queries put to the prophet by the king or some other important person. And they are not pro-government, usually. They usually are highly critical of the leaders in play. You don't find that in ancient Assyria. There may have been people who did that, and then they had to find some other job, like living in media, say, or something like that. Jokes about media don't work either, I've known. So there's an artistry here that makes the book a book that fits together. So it's not just unit after unit after unit after unit. It is a tightly woven whole. And Hosea and Amos, and I would say the Isaiah 2 to 12 are the earliest forms of this genre, and Micah probably too, of this genre of prophetic book. And they are works of art. That's the first hinterland. Another hinterland is that these are books that are profoundly emotional. And not in a shallow way, but in the deepest possible way. They grab you by the throat and force you to gasp for air. And if you don't like that analogy, which I don't, we'll try a different one later, when I think of one. They are books that they're intense, right? Maybe hip hop is our closest modern equivalent, and I mean that seriously. That maybe that's the closest we can get right now. These are books about love and justice, the third hinterland. And like many other books in the Old Testament, Hosea asks the very simple but profound question, is God just? You think about that a minute, that's a question really all over the Bible. It's the question of Job, it's the question of many Psalms, it's the question of, I think, of Lamentations in a very poignant way, and of the prophetic books. It's not obvious that God is just. After all, human beings experience terrible tragedies, even pious people do. So it requires some thinking about that. So those are some of the hinterlands, and there are others probably, but I want to move on to the text itself. So let's begin. The first section of the book is chapters 1 to 3. It is part autobiography and part parable. Any of you ever find these 3 chapters a little hard to follow? Anybody not find them hard to follow? I'm going to sit down and let you do that because they're hard to follow. And they're hard to follow partly because that's how prophetic books work, right? They have a poem, and then it's connected to another poem, and then to another and another, and you have to think about how they fit together, not just what each individual one says, but how they fit together. But it's also hard to follow because it's not always clear where the autobiography stops and the parable derived from it starts. There's a sort of circle that goes on, which then creates problems for interpreters. For example, in chapter 1, Hosea is told to marry a woman of Znunim, a woman of znut, or sexual problematicness. That's how I'm going to translate it for now. And in chapter 3, he's told to do it again. And so scholars say, is this just kind of, is there a sequence? Are you supposed to read it in order? or is it sort of a repetition of chapter 1? There's discussion about that. And I don't know the answer. It strikes me either way it's pretty bad if your name is Hosea. And it's difficult. But what's striking is that it's not really about Hosea, as I said already. It's about Yahweh and Israel. And so if you read it as a parable for Yahweh and Israel, it is sequential, and it is about renewal of a relationship, a renewal of the covenant. Or what Jeremiah, who apparently loved Hosea and read the book and knew the oracles of Hosea because he quotes them, as he also knew the oracles of Micah. And fortunately, on one occasion, his audience knew the oracles of Micah too. You remember that story? What Jeremiah, 130, 40, 50 years later, would talk about as a new covenant. The idea begins in Hosea. Anyway, the book opens, as I said last time, with the command to marry. And chapter 1 is a story of the birth of 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, with these wonderful names, Jezreel, Lo-Ruhamah, and Lo-Ami. But the names, like Isaiah's names, whose kids had even more terrible names, right? Maher Shalal Hashbaz, speeds the spoil, hastens the prey. Wouldn't you like to go to school with that name? He gives these names not just, well, yes, on one level it's a prophetic sign act. That's what prophets do. They do these very weird, dramatic things to make a point. But the point made is interesting and worth digging into. Verse 4, the Lord said to him, name the first son Jezreel, for in a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. On that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. Now, what's striking is that this text has a parallel text in the book of 2 Kings 9 and 10. And in that text, if you remember the story, a general named Jehu is commanded by a prophet, told by God, to stage a coup d'etat against the house of Omri, the Ahab's dynasty, which he does. He kills old Jezebel at the end, and her family, and the entire royal family, apparently. And in the book of 2 Kings, this event is approved of. The text says this is what he was told to do. Now, did he do it right? Maybe not. Does that mean he's a wonderful person? No, because just because the new guy is bad doesn't mean the old guy wasn't worse. So it's complicated, but not for Hosea. For Hosea, the blood of Jezreel is murder, and therefore deeply problematic. So he starts with the monarchy. The king will be punished. And then the second child comes along, a daughter, Lo-Ruhamah, because it says the word racham means to have mercy or pity, and Yahweh says, I will no longer have pity upon them or forgive them, which strikes me as extremely bad news. So much so that there are texts in which, as you know, there are a few texts in the prophets. Micah talks about this, Hosea talks about this, Amos considers this possibility, in which God either decides, or at least considers deciding, not to forgive. So we start with the king, and then we move to the people. However, there's a footnote in verse 7, which I think is interesting because it tells you a little bit about how the book is being passed on. I will have pity on the house of Judah, and I will save them. I will not save them by bow or sword or war or horses or horsemen. You remember there is the problem, and you see this in the southern prophet Isaiah. There's the question of how Judah is going to exist in this setting of great political change in the 740s, then 730s, and 720s BC. What will happen to Judah? And it's helpful sometimes just to take your concordance again and go through Hosea and see what he says about Judah. He actually says several different things, which don't seem quite to jive with each other. But I think, and that's why many scholars, Hans Walter Wolff, if you read his great commentary in the Hermeneia series, which I read in college in summertime. I was working in a lamp factory, and at lunch I would read Hans Walter Wolff, which doesn't make for good friends at the lamp factory I was working at. But and was the last nerdy thing I ever did, actually. Come to think of it. Anyway, Wolff talks about a Judahite redaction of the book. And the basic idea is you have the book that's up in northern Israel, and it's addressing northern Israel. And then it moves south, probably after the wars, because a lot of people during the wars in the 730s moved south. We know that because the city of Jerusalem quintupled in size about that time. And it's so that, and it's not very surprising. I mean, it's 20 miles. It's not like you've moved from Texas to Connecticut the way I did 25 years ago. It's a couple of days good walking. And they brought the book with them, and then they modified it because they had to think, look, okay, the prophetic word doesn't die with the setting that gave rise to it. It keeps going, right? Or as the Isaiah 40 says, the word of Yahweh remains forever, right? But if it remains forever, it has to be interpreted anew, and so that's the thesis, that what you have are folks, every time you see Judah, it's, for Wolff, it means a later addition. I don't know if that's true. It's called guessing. It's a wild guess if you write one page about it. It's a learned hypothesis if you write 50 pages about it, right? So I don't know if that's right, but there is something to it. It's not crazy. There's something to it, that the book doesn't just worry about northern Israel, it worries about Judah as well, and they do have different fates, so you have to think about how those fates relate to each other, especially because it looks like, as I read the book, I don't see anything in the book that's much later than the seventh, than say 700. Maybe there's some stuff, you can debate that, but I don't see why that's there. So this is long before the fall of Judah. And so you have to wrestle with this question. But the punchline theologically is what? It's the same one that Isaiah makes in Isaiah 7 and 8, in which he has this conversation with Ahaz, and he says to Ahaz, look, you're in deep trouble, you're about to be invaded, ask for a sign. And Ahaz does something that no king in the world would ever do. He says, no, I don't think so. Don't want to bother God with this. Which is, to use the really technical term, crazy, right? Crazy. What do you mean you don't want to say? Okay, I'll give you one anyway. All right. So, but the point is, God would save Judah. So they have the second child, Lo Ruchama. God doesn't have mercy on the north. And then we have the third child, Lo Ami, not my people. So it's not just the king who is disciplined, that's the first child, nor is it just the people of Israel in the north that's disciplined temporarily, but it is a repudiation of the relationship. You are not my people. The identity you have taken on is not my people. And then the swing. So I tried to say this yesterday, the way the book of Hosea is put together, 1 to 3, 4 to 11, 12 to 14, is you start with an oracle of doom, and then you move to hope. Unfortunately, the prophetic books don't say, and now we will have a word of hope, which would have gone better if I had a deeper voice than that. But that's how it shifts. Verse 10 in English, or chapter 2, verse 1 in Hebrew, the verses are different, and I'll get confused, but I'll do my best. The number of the people of Israel will be like the sand of the sea, which sounds like the story of what? Abraham, sure. Which can neither be measured nor numbered. In the place where it was said to them, you are my people, it shall be said, you are not my people, it shall be said to them, the children of the living God. The people of Judah, now follow this, because in verse 6 and 7, the idea was Israel will be punished, but Judah will flourish. And in verse 11, in the English text, the people of Judah and the people of Israel shall be gathered together. Which, if you read them just on their own, sound like different ideas, at least to me. These sound like different pictures of the future. Well, that's interesting at a lot of levels. But one of the reasons, and I think it's probably useful to think about this a bit, the prophets know that Yahweh reserves the right to change his mind. It's like Ebenezer Scrooge says, are these signs of things that must be or might be? And indeed, well, it's somewhere between might and must. Will be if you're on the same path. Might not be if you change. And the word of hope is stated. All right, that's the first move. Well, the three children. So you see, you moved way out of his biography. What kind of dad gives his kids these names? Right? I read recently that in America, some of the most popular trending names are words like Messiah. You think, wow. I wish my parents were alive to do that today. Self-important narcissist should be in the next name coming, maybe. But what kind of parent gives these names to his kids? That's the first interchange. The second interchange starts in chapter 2, verse 1, and goes through the rest of chapter 2. Say to your brother Ami and to your sister Ruhamah, plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. Now, are we really talking about these two poor little kids who are being triangulated by their parents against all counseling advice ever given by human beings to try to put them back together? Or are we talking about Israel and the relationship to God? And it strikes me that it's the latter. Though it is interesting that the way the metaphor works, right? You see this all over the prophets. The prophets will talk about Zion and her daughters, right? Or Israel and its children. Whereas on the ground, in the real world, these are the same people, right? Obviously the same people. But the image is driving us to think about this in a little different way. And you ask yourself, well, can I take that literally? I'm not sure actually I would know what literally means here. The metaphor is, if I'm trying to make it literal, is if you are part of Israel and you are able to hear this word of God calling out to the people as a whole, then repeat it. Join in the message in some way. And so it's an invitation, on the one hand, it's an invitation by the prophet to his hearers to join in the prophetic work. Does that make sense? To join in the prophetic work. Because it's not just the one person who comes in and speaks, it is a community that speaks. Now that I think is, in a way, if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense, because somebody had to write down Hosea's words. Maybe he did, but the classic case we have of this is the case of Jeremiah, in which Baruch wrote down his words. Somebody else wrote them down. Somebody has to write them down, and somebody has to preserve the manuscript, and somebody has to copy it some other time later. And you don't just copy manuscripts for the fun of it. You do it because you think it's important and other people will think it's important, right? So that all implies that there's a community around this prophet of some kind. I don't know, is it 6 people? Is it 600 people? Is it 7,000 people who haven't bowed the knee to Baal? I don't know how many people it is, and honestly, it doesn't matter. But there is a community here. And then he goes through this set of images. We're going to play with the images of adultery and cuckoldry and all kinds of things that are going to make me look down and not make eye contact with any of you. Images that are difficult. Now, if we're thinking about this text, what happens in the next little while? I will strip her naked, verse 3. Verse 4, on her children I will have no pity, which is a little odd because you just asked the children to talk to her. So obviously you're not supposed to take that too literally, and it's obviously not about Hosea and Gomer anymore. For their mother has played the whore, she who conceived them has acted shamefully, and so on and so on. If you're going to use this kind of language, if you're Hosea using it, that's one thing. And if it's you and me using it, that's a different thing. Obviously, I think it's obvious, he uses language like this that everybody would have found extraordinarily disturbing. What sort of human being wouldn't find it disturbing? It's designed to be disturbing. The words are designed to hurt. On the theory, I think that pain induces healing somehow. It's like you've had a bad break of a limb and it's healed poorly and the doctors break it again. My wife says don't use analogies, so I'm going to leave that one. My use of analogies is like something. Anyway, so he says, so how do you use it? Well, he's designed to shock people. For the preacher today, I think this is a challenge. There may be occasions, and there probably are occasions, in which we need to be very direct and to challenge people. But going around shocking people doesn't strike me as a very noble activity most of the time. It actually strikes me as a fairly self-absorbed and immature activity most of the time. Unless, of course, you're a prophet and the truck really is just a few inches away and you have to get out of the way. But for the most part, it doesn't seem to work quite right. And as our feminist friends have pointed out to us, I think quite rightly, I so wish that in our churches the word feminist weren't a negative word, right? Why do we have to let a handful of extremists define a word that seems to be very helpful to a lot of other people? Don't know. Maybe that's a prophetic word for some of us this morning. And this message has been brought to you by the Austin Graduate School of Theology. So maybe we'll think about that. Co-sponsored by Harding University. I just want you to know that. But no, I mean, maybe we ought to think about this a little bit. Because the language of abandonment, stripping naked and exposing, the language of humiliation, is very dangerous language. Because in our churches every Sunday there are women who have, and some men too, but quite a few women who have experienced precisely that, humiliation, degradation. So then the question becomes for us preachers, what do you do with that? Do you say, as is commonly argued, especially in mainline Protestant circles especially, but not just there, that the language is so compromised that you can't use it at all? That we simply have to say, in order to be just, as the prophets call us to be, we have to turn the approach to justice against their own words. Now that's a move often made. And I understand why somebody makes that move. I get it. And I think I could argue the case. But I'd like to argue a little different case. Because I don't know, well, I worry about that a bit. As a Christian who takes the Bible really seriously, I worry about leaning hard against a text because of my own experiences, though they are real and legitimate, and my own discomforts. I don't know where it stops, to kind of put it briefly. and I don't know what criteria I would create to make it stop. So that's, I guess, a slippery slope argument. You may decide it's not a strong one. It's up to you. But the argument I would want to make is one that is increasingly being made by a range of people, and that is to say, let's hear the words. Let's listen to what they say. And let's, in our preaching, acknowledge what I've just acknowledged, that these words, like all prophetic words, well, it's a metaphor, right? So it's not a description of reality in an absolute sense. Secondly, it is a metaphor trying to explain the relationship of God to human beings, not of human beings to each other, right? So human beings taking on the role of embarrassing other people is an act of, well, the Greeks would call it what? Hubris, right? Of profound arrogance. The Bible might just call it unrighteousness. So that's a distinction. And in preaching, I think it's okay in preaching to say, as the preacher, look, I hear these words, I don't particularly like them. I mean, the truth is, we read texts that we don't particularly like. Those are the most interesting ones, usually, and the most powerful ones. This is why if you're a lectionary preacher, some of you are and some of you aren't, if you're a lectionary preacher, make sure you read the 2 or 3 verses after the cut that they made, because they always leave out the stuff that's interesting. I mean, I just have this picture of these Victorian gentlemen sipping very weak tea and editing the Bible for sermons in the future, with Barney the dinosaur playing in the background. I know that's not true. It's a horrible thought. Some of my friends, some of my teachers were part of that. They're not that way. I get that. But it always is interesting to see what gets cut. The words are powerful. They are, like all great words, dangerous. Words that aren't dangerous aren't worth spending much time on, I think. Yeah. Right? And part of our challenge today is this. We've spent so much time trying to make the Bible contextual and understandable and embraceable by everybody that we have too often risked eliminating the danger of it. And so that the next generation that has come on, the people who are now my students, say, why bother? Well, there's a more elaborate case to be made, but I'm trying to steer it, and I don't have all day to make the case, but I think that's the direction I'd want to go. It's a series of words of judgment. However, there is a turn in your English text, verse 14, verse 16 in Hebrew. Therefore, I will now allure her. There's the turn. There will now be a word of hope. Therefore, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her and bring her into the wilderness. Now, that's an odd thing. That's not where I like to go myself. That's why I live in Abilene. I don't like the wilderness. But I bring her into the wilderness. Well, it's a story about what? It's evoking the time of the past. It is interesting, again, with your concordance sometime, just to trace the use of these words, midbar, wilderness. Because some prophetic texts have visions of this as a horrible place, and other prophetic texts see it as a grand and glorious place, like Jeremiah seems to see it that way. And Isaiah kind of has it both ways, because the book over and over again talks about environmental transformation. So that, as I like to say, Abilene becomes the Ozarks. Or heaven, either way. There is transformation. And Hosea picks up that image. There I will give her her vineyards and make the valley of Achor a door of hope. And then she will respond as in the days of her youth, as at the time when she came out of the land of Egypt. It's actually a very striking view, because Hosea also will talk about that time as a time when they were idolaters. So that's they're mixed images. Well, it was a mixed time. On that day, says the Lord, you will call me Ishi, my husband. and you will no longer call me Baali, which also can mean my husband, but has this resonance of another deity, who, by the way, is not just a Canaanite deity, right? The word Baal just means Lord, and it's a common Semitic word. But by this period, and this is the whole point of the prophets, by this period, it was an Israelite deity. They had worshipped Baal for centuries. And the prophets are saying, stop it. I will remove the name of the Baals from her mouth. They will be mentioned by name no more. I will make for you a covenant on that day with the wild critters, the birds of the air, the creeping things of the ground. I will abolish the bow, the sword, and war from the land. I will make you lie down in safety. Right? That's Isaiah as well. Same image. This is the idea in the air in the 8th century. I will make you lie down, and so on. And then a beautiful hymn at the end of the chapter. On that day I will answer, says the Lord, I will answer the heavens. And they will answer the earth, and the earth shall answer the grain, the wine, and the oil. And they will answer Jezreel, and I will sow him for myself in the land. Because Jezreel it's a pun on the Hebrew word zarah, which means to plant. You know, the Hebrew texts are very fond of puns. I know people say the puns are the lowest form of humor, but I always say that they are a form of humor. But they can also be a form of theology. And they are in Hebrew. Works better in Hebrew. I will sow him for myself. I will have pity on Lo Ruchama, right? And I will say to Lo Ami, you are my people. And here's the punchline. And he will say, you are my God. Now, that if the book had ended there, we would have said, this is a wonderful prophetic book. I'm glad it ended there. It's very nice. And it would have stood on its own quite well, actually. And that's why we have 12 more chapters. The Lord said to me, go love a woman who has a lover and is an adulteress, just as and here's the interpretation, right? Just as the Lord loves the people of Israel. So the biography has disappeared almost entirely, and the parable has taken over. Just as the Lord loves the people of Israel, though they turn to other gods and love raisin cakes. Festival food, right? So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and a chomer of barley and a letek of wine. And I said to her, you must remain as mine for many days. You will not play the whore. You will not have intercourse with a man, nor I with you. It's a celibate marriage. And what do you mean by that? Because that's an unfortunate metaphor too, right? Well, here's what he means by that. 4 and 5 is the interpretation. 4, the Israelites will remain many days without king or prince, sacrifice or pillar, ephod or teraphim. Now, the verse is interesting at a lot of levels. It's interesting because what we have is an interpretation of the next century and a half. 2 centuries, actually, in which Israel is in this state of occupation by foreign powers. In some respects, remain many days without king or prince. It's in a way a statement about the next 2,600 years, right? And that's interesting. It's also interesting, without sacrifice or pillar. You notice, if you just had this text, I'm not sure you would think that it's a problem to have a matzeva, a pillar. It's just the Bible actually takes various points of views about this. On the one hand, the prophets will often say these are inappropriate, these standing stones at open-air sanctuaries. On the other hand, the person we know who erected one in the book of Exodus is Moses. So you don't usually say Moses did it and that was a bad thing. So there are mixed views. And it seems to me Hosea isn't necessarily, at least here, worried about these particular objects. He's worried about their association with deities other than Yahweh. But without sacrifice or pillar, without ephod or teraphim, which are methods of divination, of connecting to God. And I don't think he's that worried about ephods and teraphim either. Maybe he's like Michal and David, who, when David was being hunted for the first time by Saul and his hench people, had Michal pretend that he was sick and put a circle of teraphim around him, which I think what's happening there is you have these little stone figures, and they're there to create a protective field around the sick person, sort of a force field of health or something. I don't think she put them in the bed and disguised them as David, because teraphim, well, if you're Rachel, you can carry them in your saddlebag, so they can't be the size of a human being, right? And Michal has to move them, so I don't think they're all that big. Anyway, but what are they about? I think verse 4 says, for a long time, Israel, you will have no real communication with God. But the day is coming when you will again. That's verse 5. Afterward, the Israelites will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. The Israelites will come and seek David their king. It's a very strange statement, actually. If you're a northern Israelite, you're thinking, really? This is like asking Canadians to vote in the next congressional election, right? Which is going to be the next big scandal, I'm sure. But it's a strange connection. But it's like the previous text we read at the end of chapter 1, which envisions the reunion of Israel and Judah. The whole people is put back together. I think that's the idea. And they will come in awe to the Lord and to his goodness in the latter days. So that's the first section of Hosea. And tomorrow we'll talk about the second and third sections of Hosea, which make the same sort of move. And so we won't dig in quite as deeply unless you want to come, say, at 7 in the morning, which we could do that. But it will make the same sort of move again, but with a very significant twist in the middle in chapters 6 and 7, in which the text raises the question, a very painful question, is it just for God to forgive? On that happy note, thank you for this hour.